So UNEP puts out this very nice report every year called Adaptation Gap Report, and this is from 2023, which is quite an indictment. It says underfinanced, underprepared, inadequate investment and planning on climate adaptation leaves the world exposed. We already discussed this in various ways, so I'll start with the executive summary and then I'll take some key results from the very long report, each chapter just subjectively as usual, but again it'll be a very short summary of such a nice long report. It's freely available, so you should definitely follow up. Let's start with the executive summary. Then, despite the clear signs of accelerating climate risks and impacts worldwide, the adaptation finance gap is widening and now stands at between $194 billion and $366 billion per year. Adaptation finance needs are 10 to 18 times as great as current international public adaptation finance flows, at least 50% higher than previously estimated. So you can look at the older report and older estimates, and now the climate change is ramping up, impacts are ramping up. COVID came, all kinds of vulnerabilities were exposed, climate action may have slowed down, did slow down, emissions went down and came back up, and so on. So the updates on the required finance is obviously due for an increase, as you can imagine. This is the main conclusion of a comprehensive assessment of the literature and new analysis to provide updated estimates of the costs and needs of adaptation in developing countries, as well as the international finance flows required to address these needs. There are many attempts to put funds into adaptation projects, as we have discussed before. Often even the development banks begin to do fancy footwork around confounding development projects that would happen anyway, and then adaptation projects, and you can't keep always complete synergy between development plans and adaptation plans, so there may be need for multiple funding streams, but obviously that's not going to happen. The report also provides updates on adaptation planning and implementation and concludes that global progress on adaptation is slowing rather than showing the urgently needed acceleration. As you can see, with all the wars going on and all the elections coming up and all the gut-wrenching stories about how some politicians are not focusing on climate action and the urgency of climate, how the humanity as a whole and individual states and local levels perceive the urgency is very different. So we have to do our job in pointing out the impacts and the growing risks, but humanity deals with uncertainties in its own way, individually and collectively at all scales. In view of ever increasing weather extremes such as a multi-year drought in East Africa, flooding in China and Europe, and extreme heat and wildfires in the United States of America and Canada, among others, narrowing the adaptation finance gap is of particular importance because of the higher benefits that investments in adaptation can offer in terms of reducing climate risks and improving equity and climate justice. Usually you wouldn't want a sentence with more than 20 words, but nonetheless you get the point that instead of dealing with disasters after they happen, if you adapt and build resilience, you will reduce the cost of disaster management. And now it's clear that rich countries are not really immune to climate impacts. Everybody is in this together, and the impact on GDPs is already visible and it'll keep growing. So everybody has to pay attention to investing in adaptation proactively. Left unchecked, however, increasing climate risks will inevitably lead to more climate-related losses and damages. Therefore, the Adaptation Gap Report 2023 also focuses on loss and damage to support parties in the negotiations following the decision at The 27th session of the Conference of Parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, so COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt, to establish a loss and damage fund and funding arrangements for vulnerable developing countries. This made some progress in COP28, but the fact that these things get discussed year after year after year shows that we are making tremendously slow progress, especially if we believe in the urgency of action needed. The global temperatures and climate impacts and risks continue to rise, highlighting the urgent need for rapid acceleration of global adaptation action. It's very true, but who believes it? Who's willing to act on it? Who will fund it? How will the funds flow? Sometimes countries put the funds, Green Fund, Climate Fund, Adaptation Fund, and then take it back for themselves, even though it's supposed to be an international pool meant for helping the most vulnerable countries. Current climate action is woefully inadequate to meet the temperature and adaptation goals of the Paris Agreement. While the average temperatures are already exceeding 1.1 by end of 2023, we have probably exceeded 1.5. So this is above the pre-industrial levels. Current plans reflected in the nationally determined contributions are putting us on a path towards 2.4 to 2.6 degrees by the end of the centuries. I have my comments on this entire global warming target business elsewhere, but briefly, these targets are not very scientific, so we need to prepare to just understand the impact of each additional 0.1 degree warming or 0.2 degree warming, rather than wring our hands about how far behind we are, because we are on a path of negotiations, progress in many sectors like renewables, and yet behind in many ways. Sorry about that. Somehow it dropped the recording and then told me after 20 minutes that I had paused. I had not been recording, so I'm gone back and tried to restart it. So there is a little bit of a discontinuity, but I hope we can live with it, because I don't want to lose the 6 or 7 minutes I had already recorded. Okay, so we were here about current action being woefully inadequate, continuing with this executive summary of the Adaptation Gap Report 2023. Even if the rise in temperature eventually slows as a result of more ambitious collective climate change mitigation efforts, climate risks will accelerate with every fraction of a degree because of the compounding and cascading nature of climate-related impacts. Okay, so for a while, even if temperature warming begins to slow down, the cumulative carbon that's in the system will continue the warming for a while, and impacts will continue. In addition, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change concludes that residual risks, that is, risks remaining after ambitious adaptation efforts, will persist even if the Paris Agreement goals are reached. Residual climate risks, in turn, will inevitably lead to both economic and non-economic losses and damages. This demonstrates the importance of accelerating and scaling up both the mitigation and adaptation action to respectively avert catastrophic climate change and minimize the climate impacts that remain. In addition, more focus must be placed on anticipatory, just and effective adaptation action and support. Without location-specific risk information, without the ability to develop national adaptation plans and the adaptation capacity, the finance, many global south countries are going to struggle, and they are struggling, as we will see in a minute, from how many countries still don't have national adaptation planning instruments. 1 out of 6 countries still does not have a national adaptation planning instruments. 1 out of 6 countries. And more must be done to close the remaining gap, of course. 5 out of 6 parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC, have established at least one national adaptation plan, strategy or policy, and just under half of them have 2 or more national level instruments which serve to replace or update the initial ones. So you have to make a plan, quickly realize it's not adequate and update it, and then maybe update it again, and so on. Moreover, 25% of the countries have put in place legal instruments that require national governments to plan for adaptation. So having some kind of a mandate at the constitutional level, or a highest court mandated legal requirement for adaptation, politicians may keep kicking the can down the road, so that has to be prevented. There has also been significant improvement in certain aspects of the potential adequacy and effectiveness of adaptation planning. Sorry, I have an allergy problem, very high pollution. So let me read it again. There has also been significant improvement in certain aspects of the potential adequacy and effectiveness of adaptation planning since 2021. Both findings suggest a growing determination to address climate risks, but more needs to be done to ensure implementation of planning instruments. Implementation is everything. Financing is, of course, very critical. Meanwhile, 15% of the parties still do not have a national adaptation planning instrument, and the rate of increase dropped from 4% to 1%, which is good in terms of countries not falling behind, while half of the 29 countries without any such instrument are in the process of developing one. Most of them are particularly vulnerable to climate impacts. So most vulnerable countries, which obviously did not create the problem in the first place or contributed very little to creating the problem, are now paying a price, and more must be done to support them and to close the remaining gap faster. So let's look at the context. The Conceptual Landscape of Adaptation Gap Report Series, Connecting Temperature Change and Levels of Climate Risk and Adaptation with International Climate Negotiations. This is the temperature change. We are looking at historical increases with future projections going into 2100, and these are the scenarios. Here comes my allergy. Here are the scenarios we have discussed elsewhere, the most benign ones trying to stay below 1.5 or 2, and the ones that will take us business as usual out here. We've discussed the uncertainties in these and in the historical reconstructions of the warming, but IPCC provides the risk scale going from undetectable to very high for low and high emissions in the so-called amber diagrams we discussed before. So we are at the current risks here as estimated without saying specific sectors, but obviously this depends on sectors, regions, and so on. So this is a hypothetical adaptation scenario. Basically, this is where we are headed in terms of the risk from the current risk levels, and this is what adaptation can do for us in both scenarios in terms of reducing the risk if we follow up. So the connection with the international climate negotiations has to happen in this iterative process. Negotiations on adaptation finance will influence the extent to which developing countries are able to adapt. These negotiations are framed by the global goal on adaptation and the global stocktake, which I have discussed elsewhere. And negotiations on loss and damage will help developing countries address unavoided residual risks, which means they're already facing these risks year after year, like Pakistan having floods at every year since 2010. So this is an iterative process. Loss and damage was discussed again in COP28, made some progress, but that's just less of a bad news than actual good news. We still have a long way in terms of implementation and finding the funds. Okay, the number of national adaptation planning instruments published globally each year as at 5th August 2023. So we're looking at first adaptation planning, second, third, and fourth. So we are looking at number of countries increasing nicely and then going up and down with financial crisis, with the wars, with the pandemic. So fortunately, some countries have had fourth adaptation planning instrument offered up, and you can see the numbers are relatively small, and the overall numbers are relatively small as well. And unfortunately, numbers have dropped because of the, let's say, the pandemic here. And you thought we will learn our lessons from the pandemic and start acting on climate action, maybe even use the stimulus funds to kick up the economies following COVID, to focus on green technologies, emissions reductions, socio-technical transitions to move away from fossil fuels, but that didn't happen. Fossil fuel emissions just picked right back up after dropping a little due to COVID restrictions and so on. So maybe I should leave this here, make sure the recording is overall okay, and come back and continue. So there is a little gap, as you can see. I'm not too good at editing those out, so you have to live with them, but I saw that I'll make sure that it's not too bad. Okay, so I'll come back and continue with the executive summary of the Adaptation Gap Report 2023 from UNEP. Okay.